Hey there, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments.
When people say family gatherings are warm and sacred, filled with love, baked ham, and the comforting clink of wine glasses, they're not talking about my family. Ours is more like a sitcom that forgot it was supposed to be funny. Every holiday felt like a performance, with each of us slipping into old roles, like actors stuck in a show that should have been canceled 5 seasons ago. My brother David always played the lead. The successful one, the golden boy, the finance guru who somehow managed to make even casual conversations sound like a LinkedIn post. I, on the other hand, was the quiet side character, the tech girl who still does that computer thing, as mom always put it when describing my job to her friends at book club. And Easter, well, Easter was always his stage. This year wasn't supposed to be any different. The house smelled like baked pineapple glaze and clove. Kids ran in circles high on peeps and sugar, and the dining room table was set with pastel linens that had been passed down for generations, still stained with cranberry from Thanksgiving 1987. Everyone had gathered around the table, with David at one end and my parents at the other, like they were bookends holding together this dysfunctional little library of ours. The conversation had drifted from harmless updates about the neighbor's divorce to a quick debate about electric cars versus real engines, which, as always, veered off the rails when Uncle Frank opened his second beer. I mostly sat back, sipping my Pinot, trying to keep my expressions neutral. It wasn't worth the energy anymore. Let them think I was just the quiet one. Then it happened. David turned to me, casual, almost lazy in the way he did it, and with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes, he said, "You know, I've been thinking, tech really isn't for everyone. Some people just can't cut it. It's a different world, not built for, well, creatives." The pause was intentional, the dig, surgical. The table went quiet for a second. Forks paused midair, and I felt the weight of every eye shift toward me. I smiled, just enough to not show teeth, nodded slightly, and said, "You're right, it isn't for everyone." I could feel the heat in my chest, but I kept my tone even. I didn't need to bite back. I didn't need to throw shade, not yet. And that's when Grandma, who had been unusually quiet while poking at her deviled eggs, with a level of scrutiny reserved for bomb squads, looked up, blinked through her bifocals, and said, "Wait a second, didn't you just buy the startup Emily works for?" The silence that followed could have shattered glass. David's expression froze, eyes flicking to me, confusion spreading across his face like a glitch in his normally smug operating system. I kept my smile. I didn't even look at him. I turned to Grandma, gently touched her hand, and said, "Oh, Grandma, let him finish. I'm dying to hear what else he thinks tech people can't do." And just like that, it was game on. See what no one at that table knew, not David, not my mother, not even my overly curious Aunt Susan, who still sends me Zillow listings in my own city, like I've forgotten how real estate works, was that for the past 11 months, I'd been working behind the scenes at a small but fiercely intelligent tech startup. The kind that didn't splash headlines but quietly revolutionized back-end automation for fintech systems. Our product wasn't sexy, it didn't go viral, but it worked. And for the companies that needed it, it was a goddamn lifeline, including apparently David's firm. He didn't know I was there. I'd kept it quiet on purpose. After years of dismissive comments, the eye rolls every time I mentioned a new project, the passive-aggressive questions like, "So do you just draw buttons all day?" I stopped explaining myself. I let him believe I was coasting in some vague corner of the tech world, working on apps that helped people meditate or track their water intake. He never bothered to ask deeper. But now, his own firm had acquired the startup I'd helped pivot out of near failure. I had been part of the new leadership brought in to stabilize the product. The team I led restructured its design system, rewrote the user flow, and created the technical documentation that his analysts were now depending on to understand what the hell they just bought. And yet, here he was, confidently insulting the very industry I helped shape from inside his own new asset. It would have been funny if it weren't so predictable. He stammered something about it being just a small acquisition, then redirected the conversation toward quarterly growth and other meaningless finance lingo. But the damage was done. Grandma had cracked the shell, and now everyone at the table was looking at him differently. Not because they fully understood what just happened, but because for the first time in a long time, David didn't look like the one in control. Now, before I go on, let me ask you something. Have you ever had a moment where someone tried to tear you down in front of everyone, but the truth, the one thing they didn't know, the ace up your sleeve, was sitting quietly in your pocket, waiting for the perfect moment to be revealed? Because let me tell you, there is no revenge more satisfying than the kind that doesn't need to be shouted. As David tried to recover, muttering something about synergies and streamlining operations, I reached for the mashed potatoes and passed them politely, giving him a small, knowing nod. "Thanks for the vote of confidence," I said, sweet as sugar. "It's good to know you're still investing in people like me." His jaw tightened, but that was just the beginning. There's something uniquely cruel about a rivalry that begins in childhood and never quite dies. It grows quieter with age, but deeper, more stubborn, and more layered, like an old tree twisted by wind and time. My brother David and I had been circling each other for nearly 4 decades, orbiting the same family nucleus with all the grace of 2 planets on a slow, inevitable collision course. From the outside, we were perfectly civil. He gave me birthday cards signed with best, and I thanked him with a smile that never quite reached my eyes. But underneath that facade, there was a history written in dismissals, superiority complexes, and the kind of backhanded compliments that would make strangers blink twice. Growing up, David was the prototype of success in our house. Tall, charismatic, quick with numbers, and the kind of kid who could recite the Dow Jones before he learned to shave. He was the one who won the debate competitions, brought home perfect math scores, and had his college applications read aloud at the dinner table like bedtime stories for ambition. Meanwhile, I was the one who disappeared into sketchbooks, disassembled VCRs, and wrote poetry on the backs of napkins. Quirky, smart, but as our father once said with a half smile and a full beer, not the kind who'll run a company someday. Those words stuck to my ribs for years. In college, David followed the predictable path into finance, with the same smug precision that had always defined him. He wore suits by sophomore year and interned on Wall Street summers, while I struggled through project-based design classes, where professors critiqued my work with the kind of surgical coldness normally reserved for failed heart transplants. I majored in human-centered design, a discipline he famously mocked at Thanksgiving one year by saying, "So, you're getting a degree in common sense?" The room had laughed. And I had laughed too. Because what else do you do when your entire identity is dismissed in 7 syllables? After college, I bounced through startups the way some people move through phases. First, the overambitious health tech firm that burned through cash faster than it could raise. Then the sustainable fashion app where the founders screamed at each other in Slack. And finally, the contract work that paid enough to cover my overpriced San Francisco rent, but left me wondering, more nights than I'd like to admit, whether I had completely wasted my 20s chasing things that didn't matter. David, meanwhile, landed at a firm that made money simply by moving other people's money, and he built a life that looked perfect on paper. Condo in the city, house in the suburbs, a wife who coordinated his suits and smiled through clenched teeth, and twins in matching Patagonia fleece. Still, I didn't envy him, not really. What I envied was how easy he made it all look, how certain he seemed that his path was the right one, while I had to fight tooth and nail just to convince my own parents that what I did for a living wasn't making websites. But resentment, like success, doesn't show up all at once. It builds, quietly, and it festers in silence. About a year ago, I joined a startup that, at the time, looked like it had one foot in the grave and the other on a banana peel. The product was half-baked, the code base a mess, the leadership fractured by ego and stress. But the concept was solid. Process automation for compliance-heavy industries like finance and insurance. If we could clean it up, streamline it, and market it to the right buyers, it had real potential. I signed on as a lead product strategist, with a mandate to overhaul the user experience and, unofficially, to see if the company could even be saved. I worked brutal hours, nights blurred into mornings. I wrote documentation until my hands cramped, sat through painful restructuring meetings, and pulled entire frameworks out of chaos. We laid off a third of the team. We rebuilt from the inside out. And after 6 months, our usage metrics turned around. Churn dropped. Investors took notice. Quietly, behind the scenes, we began fielding acquisition offers. I didn't tell anyone, especially not David. I had learned the hard way that some victories are best kept private until the world is forced to notice them. What I hadn't expected, what genuinely stunned me, was that David's firm would be the one to acquire us. The day the news broke, I was in a product roadmap meeting when our CEO casually dropped the name of the purchasing firm. I felt my stomach drop like an elevator in freefall. I stepped out of the meeting and stared at the press release on my phone, reading and rereading it like maybe I had hallucinated his firm's name. But it was real, it was happening, and he had no idea I worked there because he hadn't bothered to ask where I'd landed, not once. I didn't tell him, not in that moment. I wanted to see what he'd do. That night after dinner, while people were milling around with pie and coffee, I walked past the den and heard him on the phone. His voice was lower, professional, the tone he used when he was closing deals and being important. He said, "It's a shitty little product, but whatever, we'll gut it, rebrand, flip it. Easy win. No one there has a clue what it's really worth." I stood there silent, just listening. I should have been angry, I guess. But what I felt instead was something colder, something sharper. A calm that came not from confidence, but from knowing exactly how little he understood the world I lived in. The startup wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I had helped carry it through a storm. I had shaped its future. And now he thought he was going to gut it for sport? It wasn't just insulting, it was a declaration. I turned around, walked back into the kitchen, and topped off my wine. Revenge doesn't always need to be cruel. Sometimes it just needs to be precise. And I had just decided David was going to learn exactly what it meant to underestimate someone in tech. Not with a fight, not with a confrontation, but with a strategy. One I'd been perfecting for years. It's funny how the truth doesn't always come crashing through the ceiling like some cinematic revelation. Sometimes it just sits there in the room, quietly humming beneath the noise, waiting for someone to stop pretending they don't hear it. After that first awkward silence at the Easter dinner table and Grandma's unexpected comment, David had tried to recover with the forced energy of a man grasping at dry ice, smiling too wide, talking too loud, and throwing out finance jargon like confetti at a wedding no one wanted to attend. But I wasn't interested in small victories. I wasn't looking for applause or a momentary edge. I was playing a longer game, one built not on public humiliation, but on surgical precision. He thought he could ride into a space I'd helped build, tear it apart for profit, and walk away with credit while I stood silently on the sidelines. What he didn't understand, what he had never taken the time to learn, was that I didn't need to shout to be heard. I just needed the right moment to speak. That night, after the kitchen had been cleaned and the wine had settled into everyone's bloodstreams enough to bring out that soft, sentimental glaze families adopt, when the food has run out and the real conversation is beginning to simmer, I sat by the fireplace scrolling through my work Slack on my phone. It was mostly noise. Weekend silence, unread reactions, and a few stray threads about the acquisition timeline. But one message stood out. My CTO, a quiet genius named Rami who operated like a chess master in a world full of checkers players, had dropped a note into our private leadership channel. Just got wind that the acquiring firm plans to reduce headcount by Q2. We need to push out the roadmap updates before the end of the month or risk losing visibility. And there it was, the corporate translation of David's earlier arrogance, confirmed by the people who'd actually done the math. My fingers hovered over my phone screen as I thought about it. The roadmap he wanted to dismantle was mine. The product flow he was planning to gut had been built on sleepless nights and whiteboard battles I'd fought alongside engineers who now depended on the success of this product for their jobs, their health insurance, their immigration statuses. To him, it was a shitty little product. To us, it was proof that the underdog could build something worth acquiring. And I wasn't about to let that get erased because my brother wanted another notch on his merger belt. So I made a decision. I didn't rage. I didn't vent. I acted. That evening, while the family played board games and argued about rules no one remembered agreeing on, I slipped into the guest bedroom, propped my laptop on my knees, and crafted a clean, untraceable summary of our product's performance metrics. Growth charts, client renewals, API usage surges, case studies from beta clients, all sanitized of internal jargon and ready for outside consumption. I packaged it like an anonymous leak, a whisper in the right inbox. Then I sent it to a journalist I knew casually from a Women in Tech panel I had spoken on 2 years ago, someone who'd been burned too many times by puff pieces and knew how to follow the scent of a story that mattered. No names, no fingerprints, just data. I wasn't trying to tank the acquisition, I wasn't that reckless. But I was absolutely going to make it impossible for David's firm to quietly butcher the product and flip it like some garage sale find. If they wanted to pretend it had no value, I was going to ensure the entire industry saw otherwise. I was going to put a spotlight on our roadmap so bright that even the dullest investor could see what was worth saving. And then I waited. The next morning, David walked into the kitchen late, bleary-eyed and clearly irritated, his phone glued to his hand. He didn't say anything right away, just poured himself coffee like it had personally offended him. I sat at the counter with a crossword, casually pretending not to watch. Then he mumbled, barely above a whisper, "What the hell?" I looked up slowly, tilted my head, and asked in my most sincere voice, "Something wrong?" He blinked, hesitated, then shook his head. "No, just annoying press. Some idiot decided our acquisition was a bigger deal than it is." "Oh?" I said, keeping my tone flat. "What are they saying?" He hesitated again, clearly torn between his instinct to impress and his need to downplay the situation. "They're calling it a pivotal move in back-end automation, like we actually cared about the tech." He scoffed, laughed without humor. "It's a cleanup job, nothing strategic." I nodded slowly, letting my silence stretch into a subtle rebuke. Then I offered a gentle, surgical observation. "Well," I said, "sometimes the things people overlook end up being the foundation of something they didn't see coming." He stared at me, blinking like he couldn't quite parse the meaning, and I could see the thought forming behind his eyes. Was I talking about the product or about myself? The truth was, I didn't care which conclusion he landed on. What mattered was that, for the first time since we were kids, I was 3 steps ahead of him. And he knew it. He didn't know how. He didn't know why, but something had shifted. He was holding a bomb, and I was the only one who knew where the wires led. Later that afternoon, while the rest of the family was outside hiding Easter eggs for the kids and sipping from plastic cups of sangria, David's phone rang again. I watched him step away to take the call, voice tense and clipped as he paced the patio. His posture had changed, shoulders tight, hand in his pocket, jaw clenched. I could only hear fragments. "No, we didn't authorize that," and "Get me the comms team," followed by the inevitable, "Why wasn't I told about the user metrics?" That last line almost made me laugh. Why weren't you told? Because you never asked the right questions. Because you assumed there was nothing worth knowing. And now you were scrambling to protect a narrative that was already slipping out of your control. By the time dinner rolled around, the tension was thick enough to cut with a butter knife, and David was quieter than I'd seen him in years. Not defeated, just off balance, like a man suddenly unsure if the house he built was sitting on sand. I sat across from him, smiling softly, and raised my glass, not in celebration, not yet, but in anticipation, because this was only the middle of the game, and I had plenty of moves left to play. By the time Sunday brunch rolled around, the atmosphere in the house had shifted in a way so subtle that only those familiar with the quiet choreography of long-held resentment would have recognized the tension threading through the small talk, like the imperceptible tightening of strings on a violin just before a sour note pierces the air. The sun filtered in through lace curtains that hadn't been washed in at least a year, and the scent of cinnamon rolls and sausage links filled the room in a vain attempt to overpower the less palatable aroma of unease that had settled like dust on every surface. David, ever the star performer at these family pageants, looked disheveled in a way that would have gone unnoticed by anyone who hadn't spent a lifetime watching him polish his image, his collar askew, his hair not quite styled, and an impatient twitch in his left hand as he scrolled through his phone every few minutes, clearly trying to keep something under control while pretending everything was perfectly fine. The rest of the family, blissfully unaware of the Cold War unfolding beneath their noses, busied themselves with pouring orange juice, setting out jelly packets, and arguing over whether mimosas before noon constituted a bad example for the grandchildren. My mother, bless her stubborn heart, insisted that we take a family photo before the food was touched, clapping her hands like a kindergarten teacher trying to wrangle chaos into compliance. David forced a smile, wrapped an arm around our father, and stood stiffly beside me, his eyes darting between his phone screen and the camera lens like someone watching both a building collapse and a birthday party at the same time. But I didn't mind the forced smiles, the awkward elbow-to-elbow posing, or even the syrupy chorus of "say cheese" from my cousins, who still thought adulthood meant never washing your own dishes. I didn't mind because I knew that the performance was almost over, and soon the curtain would fall in a way none of them saw coming. Once the photo was snapped and the family had returned to their plates with the urgency of a prison cafeteria line, the conversation, perhaps inevitably, drifted back to business, success, and what constituted real work in this economy. David, clearly hoping to reassert control over a narrative that had begun to slip away from him, launched into a monologue about market trends, strategic verticals, and the importance of eliminating wasteful product teams in acquired companies. His tone was calm, authoritative, and steeped in that polished detachment finance people wear like armor, every word calculated, every sentence designed to project control. And then, like clockwork, Grandma struck again. She had been buttering a scone with the kind of exaggerated care only the elderly can get away with, her hearing aid slightly askew, and her reading glasses perched low on her nose, but her voice came through as sharp as broken glass when she said, without even looking up, "David, why don't you tell us a bit more about that tech company your firm just bought, the one Emily works for?" The silence was instant and absolute, the kind that sucks the air out of a room so thoroughly that even the clock on the wall seemed to pause in anticipation. David froze mid-sentence, blinking rapidly as if searching for a file in his internal index that didn't exist. For a moment, it was almost heartbreaking. The way confusion passed across his face like a cloud blotting out the sun, quickly replaced by something darker, angrier, and infinitely more fragile. I wasn't aware Emily was involved with that particular acquisition," he stammered, his voice higher than usual, forced into a register that betrayed more than he intended. "I don't think she's on any of the executive teams." It was the kind of response that would have sounded dismissive under normal circumstances. But in this moment, given what everyone had just heard, it landed like a lie that had already been disproven. I set down my fork slowly, took a measured sip of coffee, and looked directly at him across the table. "Oh, I'm not on the executive team," I said with a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "But I did write the product roadmap your team's using to restructure the platform." The silence that followed was thick enough to drown in. For a full 5 seconds, no one moved, no one spoke, and even the kids in the other room seemed to fall mysteriously quiet. David stared at me like I had just handed him a live grenade with the pin already pulled, his mouth opening and closing as he tried, and failed, to form a coherent response. "And the design architecture," I added, twisting the knife with deliberate casualness. "That was mine too. The automation flow your people keep praising as surprisingly intuitive? That was built off my specs." I let the words hang there, soft and unassuming, but heavy enough to crush a man who had spent his entire adult life pretending that I didn't matter. Across the table, Grandma gave a single nod, as if confirming a bet she'd placed years ago and had just now collected on. David stood abruptly, knocking his chair back an inch with a screech against the hardwood floor. His face was flushed, his hands clenched, and for a moment I wondered if he might actually say something honest. But instead he glared at me and muttered through clenched teeth, "You're sabotaging me." I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table, and said with a calmness that only someone who's already won can afford, "No, David, I made that company what it is. You're the one trying to sabotage it. I'm just making sure you don't get the chance." He looked like he might say more, but instead he turned, walked out of the room, and left his mimosa untouched beside his now cold eggs. The room remained silent for a beat longer, and then, as if the spell had broken, my mother stood up and began collecting plates, muttering something about how these kinds of conversations shouldn't happen during brunch. But the damage had already been done. Everyone had seen it. Everyone had felt it. And no one, not even David, could pretend anymore that I was the quiet one who didn't know what she was doing. Because now the truth was on the table, served right alongside the cinnamon rolls and scrambled eggs. And it wasn't going anywhere. By the time evening fell on that final day, the house had grown quieter in the way that only follows a storm. Not the silence of peace or resolution, but the kind of wary stillness that settles when people are too exhausted or too unsure to speak the truths they're all silently thinking. The sunlight outside had faded into a pale gold that stretched long shadows across the living room carpet, casting over the coffee mugs, the discarded board games, and the half-eaten slices of carrot cake that no one had the appetite to finish. It was as if everyone in the house, consciously or not, had entered into a shared, unspoken agreement to not revisit what had happened at brunch, to let it slip quietly into the ether and pretend that nothing had changed, though of course, everything had. David had disappeared for most of the afternoon, ostensibly going for a drive, although I suspected he had simply needed a place where he could rage privately without the inconvenience of witnesses. My mother had busied herself with overcleaning the kitchen, wiping down already clean counters with increasing aggression, while my father retreated to the backyard to half-heartedly check on the grill, which hadn't been lit since Thursday. Even the kids had calmed down, picking at their candy in silence, or zoning out in front of the old television, their usually chaotic energy subdued by the heavy undercurrent swirling through the walls. I spent the afternoon alone in the den, answering Slack messages and reviewing product documentation like it was any other day at work, though I'd be lying if I said my thoughts weren't half occupied by what had transpired earlier. There was a satisfaction, of course, a kind of visceral gratification in finally being seen, in dismantling the illusion my brother had spent years maintaining. But it wasn't simple pleasure. It was complicated, shaded by memories of every family gathering where I had bitten my tongue, every condescending smile he had offered, every time our parents had asked about his bonuses and promotions, and treated my achievements like curiosities instead of accomplishments. And now, with one sharp exchange, the hierarchy had cracked. And in its place, something new and uncertain had taken root. The final dinner of the weekend was meant to be low-key, a leftovers and light bites affair, the kind of half-hearted meal thrown together more out of obligation than appetite. The table, once overflowing with food and conversation, was now sparsely decorated with cold ham, salad in a chipped glass bowl, and a tray of biscuits that no one bothered to warm. Everyone took their seats without prompting, avoiding eye contact and speaking in half sentences, like a cast of actors stumbling through the final scene of a play they no longer wanted to perform. David eventually returned, looking like he'd aged 5 years in 5 hours. His hair slightly windblown, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes tired in a way that no amount of rest could fix. He didn't speak as he sat down, didn't make eye contact with me or anyone else, and for a few minutes, we all ate in silence, the sound of silverware scraping plates the only soundtrack to our awkward ballet of avoidance. It was only when my mother stood to pour coffee and reached for a dusty bottle of white wine that I realized the moment had arrived, the final note, the end of this long, strange performance we had all been pulled into. I rose from my seat slowly, lifting my glass, not of wine, but water, which felt somehow more appropriate, and cleared my throat just enough to command attention without demanding it. "I'd like to make a toast," I said, my voice steady, but without pretense. The table turned toward me, some with curiosity, others with the kind of tension that comes from expecting another landmine. "I know this weekend's been eventful," I began, letting a dry smile flicker for half a second. "And I think we can all agree it didn't unfold the way we expected." There were a few polite nods, mostly from the aunts who had spent most of the weekend trying to keep the peace with glazed smiles and veiled deflections. "But I just want to say," I continued, eyes locked not on David but on my parents, "thank you. Not for your support necessarily, because let's be honest, it hasn't always been easy for you to understand what I do or why I do it, but for giving me the kind of environment where I learned to fight for what I believe in, even when I had to do it quietly." My mother's face twitched slightly, an expression somewhere between guilt and confusion, and my father looked down at his plate as if the ham rind there might offer some kind of distraction. I turned toward the rest of the table. For a long time, I thought that if I didn't make a big splash, didn't hit all the milestones in the right order, then what I was doing didn't matter. But it does, and it always did, even if you didn't see it. And then finally I looked at David. "And to my brother," I said, my tone shifting ever so slightly, "I want to thank you too. Not sarcastically, not as a jab, but sincerely, because without your constant criticism, your doubt, your relentless standard of what success was supposed to look like, I might never have pushed myself to become something you couldn't ignore." He didn't speak. He didn't blink. He just stared at me, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle twitch in his cheek. His hands folded rigidly in front of him like a man bracing for impact. I raised my glass. "To the ones who underestimate us, may they live long enough to regret it." I drank. The table remained quiet, the kind of silence that said everything and nothing all at once, and then slowly, one by one, the others followed suit, lifting their glasses in awkward solidarity, not quite sure whether they were applauding or just trying to avoid being the only one who didn't. Dinner resumed. The conversation resumed. But something had shifted permanently. As the night wore on, people began to pack up leftovers, bundle kids into car seats, and say their polite goodbyes. I stayed behind a few extra minutes, gathering my things in the den, when my phone buzzed with a message from my CEO. "He's backing out," the text read. "But 2 VC firms reached out today. We'll be fine." I stared at it for a moment, letting the words sink in, not just the victory, but the implication of it. David's deal was dead, his leverage gone, and the company I had helped rescue would live to fight another day, on our terms, not his. As I stepped out into the hallway, I passed Grandma, who was sitting in her armchair with a book she hadn't been reading, sipping a half glass of wine with a look of quiet satisfaction on her face. She didn't look up as I passed, but as I reached the door, her voice followed me like a whisper meant only for my ears. "About time someone knocked him down." I turned slightly, caught her eye, and she gave me a single, slow nod. Outside, the air was cool and crisp, and for the first time all weekend, I breathed deeply and felt it reach all the way into my lungs. But even then, as I got into my car and started the engine, I couldn't help but feel something lingering. Not doubt exactly, and not guilt, but something quieter, something heavier. I had won, but I couldn't shake the feeling that in doing so, I had become a little more like him than I'd ever intended. And maybe that was the real cost of victory.